Joseph Groves Boxhall was born on March 23, 1884, in Kingston upon Hull, Yorkshire, to Miriam Abigail Groves and Joseph Boxhall Sr. He was the middle child of his family, having an older sister, Violet, and a younger sister, Mabel, who was known as May. There was a fourth child, a daughter named Enid Grace, but she passed shortly after she was born. As was common for those from seaside towns, the Boxhalls were traditionally a seafaring family. Joseph's grandfather worked at sea, his uncle Charles was a buoy master and an official with the Board of Trade, and his father was a respected master for the Wilson Line. So it came as no surprise when young Joseph chose to follow in their footsteps, despite the terrible seasickness he experienced as a boy. In June 1899, at the age of 15, after spending a year in a training school where his studies were focused on navigation and nautical astronomy, Joseph began a 4-year apprenticeship at sea, visiting Russia, Australia, North America, South America, and the Mediterranean. The first 3 years were spent aboard the Cambrian Warrior, a 3-masted bark for Thomas Williams and Company out of Liverpool, and the last aboard the cargo ship SS Hemisphere. Sadly, Joseph's mother Miriam passed away in March 1903 at the young age of 42. Despite this loss, Joseph returned to Hull the following July and commenced a period of heavy studying. His focus paid off, and on July 15, 1903, at the age of 19, he passed his exam to obtain his second mate's certificate. And with this certificate, we also get our first glimpse at his physical appearance. He stood 5 foot 9 inches tall and had dark brown hair and dark brown eyes. Newly acquired certificate in hand, Joseph began working for the Wilson Line like his father, and between 1903 and 1904, he worked as a junior officer aboard 3 different ships: the SS Iago, the SS Martello, and the SS Dido. By 1905, he was once again back in Hull, this time to sit for his first mate's certificate exam, which he successfully obtained on January 12th of that year. He remained a junior officer for the next few months aboard SS Colorado, but his success in earning his first mate's certificate did not go unnoticed, and he was promoted to second mate aboard the SS Rosario, which he served on for the rest of 1905 and into early 1906. After leaving the Rosario, he would spend the next 6 months away due to an undisclosed illness, but once he returned to sea, it was to begin nearly a year's service aboard SS Scipio. In August 1907, he was once again back home in Hull for another round of studying, this time for his master's and extra master's certificates at Trinity House. He unfortunately failed on his first attempt on August 30th, but ultimately passed just a few weeks later on September 14th. The following November, Joseph would leave the Wilson Line behind for a more prestigious appointment with a much larger company, and in July 1908, he joined the White Star Line's RMS Oceanic as her 6th officer on the North Atlantic run. Here he met Charles Lightoller, who was then serving as Oceanic's 2nd officer. Boxhall evidently enjoyed his time aboard the Oceanic, as several photos were taken during his time as her 6th, including this amazing one while the ship was docked in New York on May 29, 1909, and this one from the following July. After a brief stint on the Australian run in 1911, he was back on the North Atlantic run by the end of that year on the Arabic, but only for a few months before he was transferred to the White Star Line's newest vessel as her 4th officer, RMS Titanic. At 9 a.m. on March 26, 1912, Boxhall joined his fellow junior officers at White Star's headquarters in Liverpool to collect their tickets for their trip to Belfast, where they joined the brand new liner at the shipyards of Harland and Wolff. On April 2nd, Boxhall was directly involved in Titanic's sea trials and more or less kept himself on hand for anything that was needed. Afterwards, he took part in the lifeboat tests on the port side, which involved making sure that all the equipment and provisions were present, in place, and in good condition, then launching a few, taking them for a spin around the lock, and then hoisting them back up board and stowing them away. Once the trials were complete and all requirements were satisfied, Titanic was cleared to leave Belfast for Southampton and prepare for her maiden voyage. April 1912 saw a massive coal strike that resulted in many ships finding themselves stuck in port. In an interview many years later, Joseph commented on the effects of this strike and how it was seemingly a miracle that Titanic had managed to set sail at all, while also clarifying the later accusations that Titanic was sailing too fast at the time of the collision. There had never been any idea of a record-breaking run. Extra coal would have been needed for that, he explained. As it was, to get away on the sailing date, they'd had to rob the bunkers of the other ships of the company in port. As Titanic departed Southampton at noon, she was involved in her now infamous near collision with the New York. Titanic had snapped New York's mooring lines as she passed, and thanks to the quick actions of a couple of nimble tugboats, the New York was carefully guided to safety, sparing Titanic an embarrassing send-off. Nevertheless, the moment was not lost on Boxhall. He would later recall, "She was hoodooed from the beginning." Once at sea, Boxhall quickly settled into his shipboard duties, which was to generally assist the senior officer of the watch in all cases. And while it wasn't specifically his duty, Captain Smith seemed to call on Boxhall often to take care of the ship's charts, such as plotting course, the ship's location, and the location of ice based on wireless reports, amongst other things. In later interviews, Boxhall often specifically noted that any important reports that were received, such as those regarding navigational issues or the location of ice and the like, were posted on a board in the chart room for anyone and everyone to see. Once they were pinned on this board, they stayed there for the remainder of the voyage, and as soon as a report of ice was received, its location was immediately plotted onto the chart. Captain Smith seemed confident enough in Boxhall's abilities as a navigator that on a couple of occasions, he simply left Boxhall a note to plot specific positions on the chart, either left in the chart room or given to another officer to hand to him. Boxhall himself never saw the need to go looking for the captain to tell him he had done what was asked either. He simply told him it was done on the next time he saw him. On Sunday, April 14th, the Coronia sent an ice warning that has sent many a researcher into a tizzy, since it was one of the last messages received before Titanic struck her iceberg. At the time, though, Boxhall noted the position on the captain's chart, but did not place much importance on it, since its position was probably about 10 miles north of their track. In May 1912, during the U.S. inquiry, Boxhall explained that he had never heard of ice moving as far south as Titanic's route before. From his experience at sea, he explained, on Titanic's route at 42 degrees, the Gulf Stream was stronger than the Labrador Current, and therefore the ice would likely move northeast, not south into their path, and all of Titanic's officers seemed to agree. Later, at the British inquiry, Boxhall made the following statement regarding the ice. "All the ice I remember plotting out was to the northward of the track. If it had been on the track, or to the southward, I should have seen fit then to call the captain's special attention to it at the time I put it on. If it had been so close to the track as that I should have thought it an immediate danger to the ship, I should have pointed it out specifically to him, and I never had reason to do that." Boxhall's final watch started at 8 p.m. with 6th Officer Moody. When they arrived on the bridge, he told Moody to go on his rounds and to return by 9 o'clock. Then found 3rd Officer Pittman still in the chart room, having spent the last 20 minutes of his own watch doing calculations. Pittman left Boxhall to finish them up, then retired to his cabin to get some sleep. It took Boxhall until 10 p.m. to finish these calculations, which were based on the stellar observations taken around 7:30. He and Captain Smith reviewed them, where Smith, satisfied with Boxhall's work, plotted the position on the chart officially, and then retired to his cabin. At 10 p.m., the senior watch changed from 2nd Officer Lightoller to First Officer Murdoch. Just after 10 p.m., Boxhall told Murdoch that he was going on his own rounds, which would have taken anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour, and by 11 p.m. he returned to his cabin, where he sat down with a cup of tea. This was not usual protocol, as returning to his cabin meant that he would be leaving his post during his watch, which wasn't allowed unless he was given special permission by the senior officer on duty, known as the Officer of the Watch, which was William Murdoch at the time. Despite appearances, though, it's likely that he stepped away from duty for a short time, simply because he wasn't feeling well, and the tea was meant to help relieve some of his symptoms. It was not, despite what some conspiracy theorists may try to say, evidence of negligence or laziness on the part of the officers. Around 11:39, Boxhall heard the distinct sound of 3 rings from the lookout bell as he left his cabin, and he immediately left the officers' quarters to return to the bridge. He left via the side door that exited onto the officers' promenade, and was about halfway to his destination when he felt the collision, which he described as no more than a slight tremor. In fact, the impact was so slight, he reported, it didn't even break his stride, so he didn't think to take it that seriously in the moment. He arrived on the bridge just seconds later to find the port engine telegraph set to full astern, and First Officer Murdoch at the switch to close the watertight doors, and Captain Smith appeared at nearly the same time. "What have we struck?" he asked. "An iceberg, sir." As First Officer Murdoch explained what had happened, Boxhall stepped out onto the starboard bridge wing in an attempt to spot the ice. He took the emergency stairs down and made his way forward to begin an initial damage inspection. He took a stairwell down through the third-class passenger areas below the forecastle deck, all the way down to F deck. He found no damage and decided to report his findings to the bridge. Once he was back on the forward well deck, however, he found a passenger holding a sizable chunk of ice. After asking the man where he'd gotten it and taking it from him, Boxhall walked over to the starboard side of the well deck to find more ice littered there. It wasn't much, though, and it didn't appear too concerning, so he returned to the bridge, where he reported the seemingly good news to Captain Smith that nothing seemed amiss. Smith was still concerned, however, as the inclinometer in the wheelhouse was already indicating a 5-degree list to starboard in just the first 5 minutes after the collision. He sent Boxhall to find the ship's carpenter, one of whom he found on his way back below. His name was John Hall Hutchinson, and Boxhall promptly sent him on his way to see the captain. Boxhall continued below and now ran into John Smith, who worked in the mailroom, which he reported was now flooding. After sending Smith to the bridge as well, Boxhall made for the mailroom to have a look for himself. And when he got there, he could hear the rush of water as it flowed in, and could see mailbags floating by. At just 12 minutes after the collision, water was flooding G-deck and was mere feet away from F-deck. Boxhall once again returned to the bridge and reported what he had seen to Captain Smith, then went about seeing that the off-duty officers were woken up. Just gone midnight, the crew was now gathering and starting the process of getting the lifeboats ready. Once all the officers were sufficiently roused, Boxhall set about calculating Titanic's final position, which he was then ordered to take to the wireless room. Unable to be heard because of the roar of the venting steam, he simply passed Marconi operator Jack Phillips a slip of paper with their position and left. Within minutes, Titanic's first CQD message was transmitted. Boxhall returned to the bridge to investigate a light he had seen on the horizon earlier. After confirming that the light was the masthead light of another steamer, he promptly went for the Morse lamp key to try and get their attention. The Morse lamp was located on top of the bridge wing and used flashes of light in the same way Morse code uses sound. A long flash for lines, a short flash for dots. He attempted this for a time, but gave up after receiving no response, and switched to the distress rockets. At 12:47 a.m., the first rocket was fired, startling everyone as it lit the boat deck up with a brilliant flash of white stars. With the assistance of Quartermaster Rowe, Boxhall continued firing distress rockets at intervals of 5 minutes in accordance with international maritime regulations, while alternating with the Morse lamp. This went on for roughly an hour until about 1:45 a.m., when Captain Smith ordered Boxhall to get into Lifeboat 2, the portside emergency cutter, along with a single seaman, Frank Osman. With a capacity of 40 people, Lifeboat 2 left with just 17 on board. With such a limited number of people, Boxhall was ultimately required to row, while simultaneously instructing first-class passenger Mrs. Mahala Douglas where to steer with the tiller. After waiting approximately 100 yards away for a short time, Boat 2 eventually rounded the stern, passing under Titanic's now fully exposed propellers and dodging falling deck chairs, and made its way for a starboard gangway door. Once they got there, however, Boxhall decided not to approach. Over the following years, Boxhall gave at least 3 separate reasons as to why he didn't take on more passengers from this gangway. 1, that the starboard gangway wasn't actually open as he expected it to be. 2, that Titanic's gradual settling into the water was creating suction that would have overwhelmed his small boat. And 3, that the gangway was in fact open, but there was such a mob there he feared a rush on his boat would put the passengers already in his care at risk. The actual reason has been lost to time, but ultimately Boxhall ordered the boat to row away about half a mile, and here they stayed for the rest of the sinking. At the U.S. inquiry, when asked about going back to pick up survivors, Boxhall recalled, "I could not see anybody in the water. I was looking around for them, keeping my eyes open, but I did not see anyone. And that if he had, he would have taken them in the boat at once. I should have taken them in as far as safety would allow, but I did not see anyone in the water." From Boat 2's position, he also couldn't see any of the other lifeboats, save for a dim glow from their lamps, so he lit a few green flares, hoping to bring them all together, but it didn't work. Boxhall's forethought to bring this box of green flares likely aided in Carpathia's rescue of the survivors, though, as Captain Rostron later stated that he could see the green lights some 10 miles away and steered in their direction. Boat 2 was the first one picked up around 4 a.m., 1 hour and 40 minutes after Titanic had gone down. The passengers were carefully pulled aboard the Carpathia, some by ladder and some by bosun's chairs. The children were hoisted aboard in canvas bags. Captain Rostron kept asking if there was an officer on the boat who could come up to speak with him, but Boxhall insisted that he would only come up once his boat was empty. Once his task was completed, Boxhall was met on board by Second Officer James Bissett, who promptly brought him to the bridge. After the passengers and lifeboats were brought aboard, Captain Rostron was going to put his officers on double watches, but Boxhall, along with Pittman and likely Lowe, all unable to sleep, pitched in and went on watches as well. Carpathia turned around and started off for New York. The Carpathia arrived in New York on the rainy night of April 18th. It is said that some 10,000 people had gathered in Battery Park to watch her come up the river. She first stopped at White Star Line's Pier 59 to drop off Titanic's lifeboats, then quietly docked at Cunard's Pier 54. Once they went ashore, Boxhall and the 3 other surviving officers were promptly subpoenaed to appear at a hearing at the Waldorf Astoria the following morning. The hearing here lasted just 2 days before it moved to Washington, D.C. on Sunday the 21st. However, Boxhall was forced to visit a doctor once he got there, as he was in pain, and had been since arriving in New York. The doctor, Charles C. Marbury, ultimately diagnosed him with pleurisy, which is an inflammation of the lining of the lungs and chest cavity, commonly caused by an infection such as the flu, which can also be exacerbated by factors such as those Boxhall had encountered on the night of the sinking. The cold temperature, combined with the exertion of rowing, and the lack of rest while on the Carpathia. It can be very painful and can make it very difficult for the sufferer to breathe or even speak. Yet, despite his illness, Boxhall diligently showed up to testify on Monday the 22nd, where he was put through just over 3 hours of questioning, answering roughly 900 questions and speaking nearly 8,000 words. He was feverish, nervous, and quiet, often clasping his hands together so they wouldn't shake, and was nearly constantly asked to speak up so he could be heard. He was due to continue his questioning the following morning, but a note from Dr. Marbury showed up in his place. Boxhall had been confined to his bed at the Continental Hotel and was not in a fit state to appear before the committee for further questioning. The committee no doubt suspected that the ill health of one of their most important witnesses was strangely convenient, but Charles Lightoller visited Boxhall at least once and confirmed his friend's illness to them. After a week's convalescence, Boxhall returned to the inquiry on April 29th, where he was questioned by Senator Smith during the day, but was then asked to answer further questioning in a separate room downstairs, away from the main room, with Senator Burton. Smith was apparently dissatisfied with the answers he was getting and thought Burton would have more luck. Once the U.S. inquiry concluded, Boxhall and his fellow surviving officers were allowed to leave Washington and return to New York for their return trip to England aboard the Adriatic on May 2nd. 11 days after arriving in Liverpool, Boxhall was summoned to appear before the British Board of Trade inquiry into the sinking, overseen by Judge Lord Mersey. Most of his testimony here concerned lifeboats, the navigation, and the ice warnings. Once the inquiries were concluded, Boxhall was allowed to return to duty for the White Star Line, first serving as 4th officer on the Adriatic in July 1912. By that November, he was possibly aboard the SS Irishman on a trip to Port Adelaide, Australia, but this is unconfirmed. Not much is known about Boxhall's life for the next few years. He was briefly engaged to a woman from Australia, but the engagement was called off for unknown reasons at some point during his service in the First World War. On May 27, 1915, he was promoted to lieutenant in the Royal Navy Reserve, where he was given a 1-year commission aboard the HMS Commonwealth. Afterwards, he was given command of a torpedo boat in Gibraltar. With Boxhall's service in the war seemingly uneventful, he returned to England once the war was over, and in March 1919, he married Marjorie Bettles at St. Andrew's Church in Sheffield. Though Joseph and Marjorie were happily married, the couple had no children, though they did have several dogs they loved dearly. In May 1919, Boxhall returned to the White Star Line, where he spent the next 4 years aboard the SS Cedric and the SS Regina. He was promoted to Lieutenant Commander of the Royal Navy Reserve in May 1923, and on June 30th, 1926, he was appointed 2nd officer aboard RMS Olympic. Like many businesses in the 1930s, both the White Star Line and their rival the Cunard Line encountered financial troubles, and the two companies eventually merged in 1933 to become Cunard White Star. Boxhall managed to survive the merger, and he was appointed 1st officer aboard the RMS Aquitania, and was later promoted to her chief. In 1937, Cunard produced a large advertisement that circulated in Life magazine and National Geographic. Boxhall made a striking appearance in this advertisement, shown as chief on the bridge of the Aquitania. He went on to serve as chief officer aboard the Scythia before finally retiring from the sea in 1940 at the age of 57 after a 41-year career. For the survivors of the disaster, Titanic was a subject that many of them, obviously, refused to talk about, and Joseph Boxhall was no different. He was known as a very quiet man throughout his life, but he made it well known that he didn't want to talk about the Titanic's loss. But in the late 1950s, to the sheer surprise of his family, Boxhall's reticence to speak on the matter changed completely. In 1956, author Walter Lord published the book A Night to Remember, which detailed the events of April 1912 for the first time. Though Lord reached out to him, Boxhall refused any involvement with the book, apparently suspecting that the author had some sort of connection to Stanley Lord, the captain of the Californian, the ship Boxhall had seen on the horizon and had tried to get the attention of all those years earlier. He apparently still had some strong feelings about the Californian and the fact that she never responded to Titanic's distress, and he ultimately didn't want anything to do with the book. The novel proved to be such a success, however, that just 2 years after its publication, a dramatization of it was released in 1958, starring Kenneth More as Second Officer Charles Lightoller. While the film was in production, Joseph Boxhall was asked to be a technical advisor. He was hesitant, but his close friend Harry Grattidge was ultimately able to persuade him, along with his niece, who told him that it was his duty to see the poor ship sunk properly. He agreed to take on the advisory role, though he would need some assistance. Then, in his early 70s and dealing with a few health issues because of his age, Boxhall asked his friend Harry Grattidge to assist him on set. Grattidge had a successful career at sea in his own right, working his way up through the ranks of the Cunard Line to become commander of the ships Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. Working on A Night to Remember was apparently good therapy for Boxhall, as it seemed to finally give him an outlet to talk about what happened. The usually quiet man finally opened up about the events of that night in 1912, and even became actively involved in promoting the film. There is some amazing footage of the day he visited the film set, and one can't help but wonder what was going through his mind that day, or what he must have been feeling in this moment as he viewed the film for the first time. To acknowledge their assistance, both Joseph Boxhall and Harry Grattidge were given an acknowledgement in the opening credits of the film. He was also present at the London premiere at the Odeon Theatre in Leicester Square on July 3, 1958, as was his former shipmate, Herbert Pitman. Boxhall continued to share his accounts of Titanic's loss into the 1960s, and on October 22, 1962, he sat for an interview with the BBC. It's an incredible account, and if you want to hear it for yourself, there will be a link in the description. However, it should be noted that Boxhall was 78 years old at the time this interview was broadcast, and his family suspected that he may have been suffering from some form of Alzheimer's or senility by this time, so some of the things he mentioned may or may not be accurate. Boxhall also exchanged letters with a man in Massachusetts who would go on to found the Titanic Enthusiasts of America in 1963, which would later become the Titanic Historical Society. The society still exists today and runs a small museum in Indian Orchard, Massachusetts, where it continues to work very hard to keep Titanic's memory alive. Joseph Groves Boxhall passed away from a cerebral thrombosis on April 25, 1967, at the age of 83. His remains were cremated, and according to his last wishes, his ashes were scattered at sea. At 41 degrees, 46 minutes north, by 50 degrees, 14 minutes west. The final position he had calculated for Titanic.
For a long time we didn't move the boat when we laid off on the starboard side. You could see by the arrangements of the lights, all the lights were burning, and you could see that she was going down. You could see that her stern was getting pretty low in the water. She was certainly going down, there was no doubt about it then. And well, we got away clear of the ship, and we just laid on the oars and until eventually they realized that she'd gone, and we heard all the screams. We couldn't do anything.